Hello, and welcome to the first proper episode of Men in Cars, the podcast where we talk about the history of motorsport with or without men. So drumroll please. Today we're talking about Brooklands racetrack, which I thought would be a very good all-encompassing topic for this podcast, because not only is it very important in the history of motorsport, or more specifically British motorsport, but one of the main attributes of its history is the involvement of women in motorsport. So today we'll be kind of taking quite a chronological approach, looking at the circumstances in which Brooklands was built, how it was managed, and how kind of motorsport as a culture really developed, and what this meant for women, what this meant for kind of the attitudes that, or stereotypes, motorsport tends to hold today. So let's get into a little bit of background information. So Brooklands is located in Weybridge in Surrey, which is great because guess what? Two of my besties, Orla and Amelia, are locals. So without getting too technical, not only because I'm not an expert myself, but also I don't know how entertaining that would be. The track is shaped kind of like an oval with two very high banked corners, which was unique for a few reasons, but at the time it kind of meant that there had to be special rules for positioning and overtaking. So, for example, on the banks, which, only the really fast cars can drive there basically, and you could only overtake on the right, so it kind of adds a layer of complexity to the circuit, makes it different to a lot of places where cars would typically race. So it's 2.767 miles in length, and there were various kind of different layouts for this track. So you've got the Grand Prix circuit, which kind of had much more contemporary chicanes, mimicking the layout of other European circuits that were very popular at the time. You've got kind of an outer circuit, which was used basically just for speed trials, testing. It was very high-speed straights, which was not common for circuits of the time. We also have Campbell Circuit, which was used kind of a bit later into the time that cars were racing at Brooklands, and it was built kind of to compete with other emerging racetracks in Britain that cropped up, such as Donington Park, and resembled a much more traditional racetrack basically. So Brooklands was really unique because it was actually the first purpose-built racetrack in the world. The track was kind of thought of and developed by Hugh and Ethel Lock-King, who sought to build a permanent track for motor racing. Like I said before, they were previously held on public roads, and more specifically in the UK, the government had just enforced a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit on public roads. And at the rate that motor technology was developing, that simply was not fast enough. So it was a specific venue for just British cars where they could be tested and race. And Hugh Lock-King really kind of wanted to develop the British auto industry in particular, just because other countries such as France, their manufacturing was developing so much quicker. So a specific venue where cars could be kind of tested and raced was seen as a real necessity in Britain at the time. And he was right, really, because after the track was opened in 1908, aerodrome was also built. So the combination of the track and the aerodrome being kind of state-of-the-art facilities meant that engine and plane factories kind of began cropping up around the surrounding areas, because a testing facility like Brooklands had never really been seen before, so they would gain significant advantage on the products they were manufacturing. The production of Brooklands costs Hugh Lock-King nearly his entire fortune, so the equivalent of kind of 11 to 16 million pounds today. So even though it was a success, it was still a huge strain on the Lock-King fortune, also on Hugh in particular, on his health. So I believe before the construction of this track, he was not in the best health. So as this began to deteriorate due to the stress of developing Brooklands, his wife, Ethel Lock-King, took over supervision and paid off any remaining debts. Now, we will talk about Ethel a bit more in a couple of minutes, because she played a really important role in Brooklands in general, in how it developed over the years, which is often overlooked in a lot of sources that I found, and a lot of information about Brooklands. So after taking 9 months to build, the first kind of procession at Brooklands took place on June 17th, 1907, where Ethel Lock-King led the first procession around in her italic car. Now, many kind of prominent races followed. I won't go into all of them, but what began to develop in Brooklands was that kind of elitist culture that many people really associate with motorsport even today. So at the time, in the early 20th century, only extremely wealthy aristocrats could afford race cars, because even the vast majority of the population could not afford road cars. You think this is the very early days of the invention of motoring in the first place. And even in Brooklands, this fact was very much kept in mind and intentional, because their entrance fees were the equivalent to approximately a week's wage for kind of the average working class worker. So even kind of spectating the races was so unachievable for anyone that was not in the upper class. And even the motto of Brooklands was the right crowd and no crowding. So, when we talk about Brooklands being significant in the kind of modernisation of motorsport from a feminist standpoint, it's quite important to consider that in so many ways it was not that progressive, and how that has inadvertently caused a lot of the problems we have in motorsport culture today. So as mentioned earlier, Ethel King led the first procession around the track, and not only that, but she also raced in the 1908 Ladies Silver Bracelet Handicap, which was a very notable achievement, primarily because at 1908 women were still banned from racing. So even the notion of this race being allowed to go ahead, that was very significant, and it was also an opportunity for her to prove her skill in motorsport as well. So not only was she kind of obviously a skilled racer, but in terms of her leadership role, she was a very prominent figure, not only within Brooklands, but also throughout World War I in her involvement in the British Red Cross as well. So after World War I, Brooklands kind of entered its golden era of motorsport, if you will, and Ethel King, in my opinion, was a huge contributing factor to this, because when Hugh King unfortunately died in 1927, she took over the Brooklands Automobile Racing Club, which meant that she was in control of the financial proceedings and also who was allowed to participate in races. So that kind of segues into the peak of Brooklands, which was in the interwar period where racing was really at its peak. And if you look at any kind of writings about motorsport from this period, they all mention Brooklands. It was really the place to be, basically. So throughout the interwar period, many speed record attempts were held, as well as the first British Grand Prix and many 500-mile races. Now, I could go on forever about the achievements that men have had, and not that they're not important, obviously they are, but I really want to focus in this episode on the role that women had and their achievements that took place at Brooklands, because I feel like that's really what makes Brooklands special, and it's not talked about as much. So in the first couple of decades Brooklands was active, women were actually banned from racing. It wasn't a case of there weren't many women who were willing to participate. It was straight up the BARC, which is the Brooklands Automobile Racing Club, said women are not fit for racing. They didn't allow it. The only exception was in the 1908 Ladies Bracelet Handicap, which is the one that Ethel King won, which was a one-off occasion and seen kind of as a novelty race. It seems that it wasn't kind of taken as seriously. So a lot of the aspects of this first race for women were taken from horse racing. So the racers were allowed to wear kind of coloured outfits or accessories. This was kind of in place of car numbers to see which drivers were in which cars. Also, I found in kind of writings about this race that women would secure their skirts with cord so they would not rise up over their knees, because what would be worse than a woman driving a car and also showing her knees? So even after this race, the BARC was still not buying it. They were not budging, and it took until 1928 when Ethel King took over the BARC where women were allowed to race in female categories. So this was ladies only handicaps, they called them. And whilst this was a significant step forward, obviously, it wasn't until 1934 where women were really allowed to drive on equal terms with men, which is really kind of the ultimate goal for female racers. So there are loads of really prominent female figures who really made their mark at Brooklands. I won't go into all of them today just because I want to kind of save them for future episodes, but a couple of examples are Kay Petra, Gwenda Hawkes, Beatrice Schilling, Elsie Wisdom, And all of these women kind of really proved themselves to be worthy competitors against men. And their achievements were also praised in various articles that were written at the time. And particularly Kay Petra, her achievements were very well documented. So now we've kind of talked about the specific events in the history of Brooklands, or specific signs of progression for women's racing, but where a lot of debate over how significant this time was for women really comes in the culture of motorsport and how society saw these women. Because as we know, kind of on paper, even though it may seem that women were completely equal to men and able to pursue their sport as they wish, in reality this played out very differently. So the interwar period kind of between 1918 and 1939 was a really strange kind of time in terms of the dynamics of society in general, not just at Brooklands. So what you had was World War One really shifting the public image of young women. So obviously, as men began to go off to war, many industries in Britain needed workers, and women kind of took up these roles, which in turn changed the way they thought about their role within their families and within society in general. So you've got the image of kind of the new woman, so a kind of flapper-esque figure, I think, kind of comes to mind quite a lot when you think of women, particularly in the 30s. And whilst that is kind of an exaggeration, you know, wishes to pursue a more vibrant social life and pursue leisure activities was definitely present. For quite a lot of women, the idea of committing to marriage and motherhood for their entire lives was seeming not that appealing. And also with the vote coming in 1918, they had kind of a new political influence where they wanted to harness a sense of independence, basically. So in terms of motorsport, this really meant that the wishes women might have had previously to compete in sport was suddenly becoming a reality. So now it was kind of more popular for women to take up sport, leisure activities. The popular body type was a lot more athletic and a lot more suited to kind of physical activity. And the participation of women in sport was really heightened in media, so in cinema and in newsreels. The concept of women pursuing leisure was seen very much as kind of a commercial phenomenon, which kind of plays in favour and against women in motorsport, because whilst it makes the notion of women racing cars a bit less foreign for the public, it also means that the professional integrity of the drivers was kind of diminished, because lots of people thought that female racing drivers and aviators as well were kind of playing into this celebrity status and only doing it for attention because they wanted to shock and lower moral standards, which was obviously not true. So it's still today amongst historians, it's a really kind of highly debated topic of whether this period was a sign of progress or whether it actually was just not as great as people imagined it to be. And whilst this kind of touches more generally on the study of feminism throughout the kind of 20th century, I think that this period at Brooklands was definitely a step in the right direction. I wouldn't kind of label it as a period of utopia for women's motorsport, because there was definitely a significant pushback, particularly from Brooklands itself. From the BARC, kind of officials were really worried about the effect that motor racing would have on the integrity of women and on the public image of motorsport as well. They thought it would take away that kind of macho image people have of motoring, and even with having a separate ladies' automobile club, it was really looked down upon. It was thought of that the worlds of racing and female leisure activities could just not mix. So looking at Brooklands as an institution, I would say that overall at this time it definitely tried to hinder the progress of women. And I think that the significant achievements that came that helped push their integrity was down to those specific figures. I think that, like many aspects of motorsport today, it's, you know, those big companies at the top, all they're trying to do is push down women, and it's down to a few specific figures such as Ethel Lott King or Kay Petra that have the financial means and the kind of mental grit to really push against that, which is quite frustrating, really. So that now kind of takes us up to the decline of Brooklands, basically. So this was mostly due to World War I and World War II. During the First World War, the grounds were really used for testing of military equipment, so mainly planes and stuff like that. And this process was kind of resumed in 1939 when World War II broke out. So the whole track, or the whole site, was basically camouflaged to hide where military planes were being produced. And this meant that even with that protection, the track was pretty badly damaged. And by the time the war finished, there simply was not enough funds to repair this. So in 1946, the grounds were sold to a company that owned an aircraft factory nearby, and this meant that the racetrack was gradually converted to facilitate more aircraft, basically. So parts of the banking were kind of demolished just to make aviation easier. So this was where the home for British motorsport was moved elsewhere, mainly to Silverstone, where the Brooklands Owners Club was relocated. And Brooklands just kind of remained as a relic, basically, of pre-war motorsport. So today this is kind of preserved with the Brooklands Museum, which contains old racing cars, aeroplanes, and is really dedicated to its heritage because, as I've just mentioned, a lot of it was really destroyed to make room for planes and also kind of office space, car parks, stuff like that. So any remaining sections of the track were placed under a preservation order in 2001 to prevent any more destruction. So parts of the old banking are kind of still there. Not all of it is open to the public, but I'm sure you can see lots of significant parts of it. And the site was eventually bought by Mercedes-Benz in 2004. So that brings us to the end of that little summary of the history of Brooklands. I hope you all enjoyed, hope you learned something new maybe. I also hope this actually makes sense. This is kind of like I'm writing an essay, but I'm saying it out loud and I can't really... I mean, I know I can edit it, but, you know. So I'll link all of the kind of resources I've used in the description somewhere, wherever you're listening. And please give this a 5 stars on Spotify. We now have Apple Podcasts. We didn't last week, but we do now. And give it a thumbs up on YouTube, subscribe, all that fun stuff. And I will see you next week, where an exciting episode, because we'll be talking about the Monaco Grand Prix, and guess what's also happening next week? The real life Monaco Grand Prix. I have organised this so well. Just so happens we're doing another track next week. Not all of the episodes will be on tracks, I promise, if that is not your cup of tea. But anyway, thank you so much for listening and have a lovely week. Bye!